everybody. It's Monday, April 4th. Believe it or not, we're already into the second quarter of the year. And that means it's time for another episode of Chatting with Agnes and Cecilia, Nonprofit Conversations. I'm one of your hosts, Cecilia Sapp. I am the principal and founder of Rogue Tulips Consulting. And I'm here with my friend and co-host, Agnes. I'm going to throw it over to Agnes to introduce herself.
Thank you, Cecilia. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our global audience, wherever you're joining us from. My name is Agnes Amos Coleman. I'm an association executive. Over to you, Cecilia.
Thank you, Agnes. And we are really pleased today to have first-time guest Justin McCarthy, who is the CEO of PRMIA. And Justin is going to say hello and tell us a little bit about himself and his organization. Welcome, Justin.
Thank you so much for having me here. So I'm Justin McCarthy. I dropped the C in because Justin McCarthy is quite a well-used McCarthy name here in Ireland, so I've had to distinguish myself from several other Justin McCarthys. PRMIA, which you mentioned, is the Professional Risk Management International Association, and we're a global body for risk professionals who work in financial services. We actually were founded about 20 years ago, and we split off from a well-known firm called GARP, the Global Association of Risk Professionals, and we're in our 20th year at the moment, and I'm the most recent CEO. We actually made the decision to move from having an executive director title to chief executive back when I was chair of the board a few years ago. And for myself, I'm actually originally a computer scientist. I've worked my way through various jobs in PricewaterhouseCoopers, Bank of America, the Central Bank of Ireland here. And I've held leadership roles in risk and compliance, including in Ulster Bank, which is it's the Irish entity for what was RBS is now NatWest. And also, before I became CEO here of PRMIA, I was the Chief Risk Officer and Head of Compliance for a investment fund or firm here in Ireland.
That is quite an impressive background, and thank you for bringing that to the nonprofit world, Justin, because we do need that too. Mm-hmm. So how long have you been in your current position as CEO of PRMIA?
I'm afraid to say only about 4 months. So I was approached late last year and asked would I, there was a search put on from the board because our previous CEO was not renewing his contract. And I was approached and I came on in a parallel sense in November. But really, once I was in the door, I quite quickly took over and started doing a lot of work. What's interesting is I actually started as a volunteer years ago, worked my way up through our chapter structure, and was actually chair of our global board for several years as well.
And you know, sorry, go ahead, Cecilia. I was going to say.
Oh, I was just going to say, sorry, Agnes. We're both obviously interested in this topic, Justin. Sorry, we talk over each other sometimes. But I was just going to point out your volunteer leadership path, your journey. That's a really classic example of a volunteer leadership funnel. And then the fact that you were willing to step into this leadership role for your colleagues and take over the association is fantastic. So congratulations on that, and happy anniversary on the 20th year. I'm going to throw it over to Agnes for her question.
That's great. Thanks, Cecilia. And you know what, listening to your background and a lot of what you've done in the risk world, it's quite impressive. And of course, given the turbulent times that we're in, I am very interested, and I know our global community are, to find out, based on what you've done, based on your experience, how do we as the association community proof risk our business? Because as you know, we've had really unpredictable and disruptive, situations over the past couple of years. And we're just interested in getting this conversation going because it's an issue that we're all grappling with, Justin.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because like many associations, our chapters are one of our greatest assets. So, we often have discussions, should we charge for chapter events and so on? And I've resisted that for years because it's probably the cheapest and best form of marketing you can have. But all of a sudden, 2 years ago, that all goes away. All of a sudden, you cannot do a in-person chapter event. And I'm glad to say, with probably very little prompting from our central organization, a lot of our chapters pivoted very quickly to virtual events. Now that's had two advantages for us. It's allowed us to continue having some element of our chapters exist over the last couple of years, But also, because these are recorded, we've built up a huge volume of recorded, what are essentially webinars. And now when I'm trying to sell people, and I have to use that term, I do a lot, I've done a lot of work over the years, but I have to use the word sell. Even though we're a non-profit, we have to make a surplus, we have to build reserves. When I'm selling PRMIA, I say, become a sustaining member, and you can actually get access to all this material which is sitting on our website. But I'm speaking to you now, as we know, in April 2021, and we're seeing the Zoom fatigue, and that's a real issue at the moment. So what I'm finding at the moment is we're suddenly having to shift from a situation where we've had all this virtual stuff going on to seeing, can we go back to in person? And if you want to hear a little bit more, I'm actually looking at doing a guerrilla hybrid event in 2 weeks' time, which will allow us to see if we can enable our chapters to do some hybrid stuff so we can maintain the local networking of having an event in person, but also keep that global community going.
And I'm sorry if I could just make a clarification. Zoom fatigue is hitting all of us. We're actually in 2022, not 2021. So everybody, it's 2022. No apologies needed. I was just
I have a calendar in the bottom right hand of my screen here. I haven't been left out much lately.
It doesn't. Many of us have not. We've actually stayed in because of the issue of risk that has been raised over the last 2 years. And I was just talking with someone about how the last 2 years, 2020 to 2022 so far, even though things are opening up a little bit now, it's really worked our sense of time.
Yeah.
Things happened. Like I had a lunch on Wednesday and thought it was last Friday. But it was actually just this week. So it's within the last week. I should say it was within the last week. But I
had a great meeting the other morning with one of our partners here in Ireland, the Institute of Banking, and the Deputy CEO, Ken O'Sullivan, was saying to me, "This is my second in-person meeting in 2 years." He had another one the same day. So I think we're all suddenly going from being, pardon the phrase, at home to suddenly having to realize that we're back out there. And I think for associations, you can't sit and wait for this to happen. You have to be planning now. You have to be saying, okay, we are suddenly going to have people who want to meet in person again. What are we going to do? And some of our, we have some virtual events related to ESG, environmental sustainability and governance, and cyber that are coming up in May and June. But I had contingency plans or mitigation in place that if we had to pivot any of those to hybrid, we would do that, that we would pick some city, probably London or New York, where the majority of our speakers were, and have them meet in a room, maybe get some participants there and actually pivot it to hybrid. That hasn't proved necessary so far, but I think you almost have to see, is there going to be a step forward or backwards from, from completely in person to completely virtual to hybrid in the middle, that you may have to find where we are. And we're fortunate at the moment. Omicron seems to have been, my sympathies with anybody who's lost family to Omicron, but it seems that between the strain that it is and other things that have been done, such as vaccination, it's a more benign variant. But I dread to think, could something suddenly emerge in a few weeks and we're all in lockdown again. So for myself as a risk manager and as an association leader, I have to have contingency plans in place that if something happens, we can pivot back again. And I think that's the core of, I often say this when I've been a consultant as a risk management, I've been a leader in organizations risk management, and you sometimes have to think everything you do is risk management. So if someone says, oh, well, just in case we're booking this, we're trying out this tool, or just in case we're engaging with this firm, that's risk management. You just don't know it. You can put it in your, you can have risk registers and all these reports and so on, but it's sometimes just common sense. It's saying, okay, if there was some change during the summer, how would we deal with our autumn and winter events? And part of what I'm doing with this, so I'm flying out to Amsterdam in a couple of weeks' time, where we have one of our chapters, and I'm taking just a bunch of equipment I had got off eBay and so on, including even the amp that's sitting behind me here. And I'm saying, okay, we'll do a hybrid event. We'll do it on the cheap, on the fly, document that, and then share that with our chapter network around the world and say, don't be afraid. If you want to do a hybrid event, this is how we did it with a few things put together. The reality is you could do it with some very expensive providers. And if you have the budget, do it. But if you have chapters that are, they're good volunteers, you may not have budget for them and so on, it's to say to them, have some event. And if I can focus on that for a moment, I think sometimes chapters can get very hung up on that they have to have a huge all singing, all dancing event. I often say to chapters in development, have something small, meet in a cafe with a bunch of your peers, whatever association you're representing. The first ever PRMIA chapter event in Ireland was a couple of us met in a pub, and I know that sounds like a stereotype, and we had a chat, but before we knew it, we had support from an organization, and we had our in-person meetings and so on. So networking is something that we all want to do. And while we've all gotten much better at doing business over Zoom, and that's what we're doing here, we also still want to meet in person.
That's right. Yeah. And I love your commitment to your chapter network. I'm a former chapter relations professional and did that for a good chunk of my earlier part of my career. And they are really important to any success because that is really how people participate in an organization, whether it's a national organization or an international organization. So encouraging that, I applaud you for that. That's very important. And let's talk a little bit more about risk management.
Yes.
Because there's so many levels of it. I personally think that what the lockdown did, and then now we're trying to segue back into some in-person and people are talking about risk more. I think we were forgetting there always was risk in in-person meetings, whether it's a slip and fall or I was on staff at a specialty bar association. The hotel we were having our conference at had a fire one day and a flood the next. So there's always some level of risk.
Did the flood put out the fire?
Unfortunately, no, but you will appreciate this, Justin. The flood was outside the crisis management sessions.
That
works well. Been too useful if the flood happened and put the fire out. But no, they were in 2 different days in 2 different parts of the hotel. But bringing it back to the risk issue, there are slip and falls. There's people getting a food they're allergic to. Nut allergies can be deadly to people. We don't think about these things. So how do you incorporate some of that risk management background you have that you're bringing to this international association? Because there is that risk at all levels. There's risk with dealing with staff. There's risk with having an office, everything. So what are some of those lessons that you're bringing from that?
I think to start with, look for some kind of, and I'm going to use the word taxonomy, look for some kind of risk taxonomy. So at least you know what to look at. Because you could find yourself focusing on one particular set of risks and completely forgetting another. So back when I was with the Central Bank of Ireland, I worked on a project called PRISM, which was a risk-based supervision framework for all the regulated entities in Ireland. And we had 10 risk categories, so like credit risk, operational risk, market risk, liquidity risk, and then sub-risks under those. And I've gone on and developed on top of that, and we're actually releasing a PRMIA risk taxonomy in the next couple of weeks to join the plethora of other risk taxonomies in the world. But it's actually to look at, okay, you could have somebody in your association who's the risk person, and maybe they are focusing on stuff like slips and falls and so on and so forth. And you could say to them, that's brilliant. Within operational risk, you've looked at like health and safety or you're saying about staff, workplace relations. But actually to step back and look and recognize that you may have governance risk and strategic risk. So within governance risk, do you have a quality board? Do you have quality management? Do you have to actually bring in other functions like internal audit or something? Because as nonprofits and as associations, we often have to remember that we should ensure that we have the highest standards of governance. So think about those different areas. Are you a viable entity? So within that particular risk category, you can say, okay, is your entity viable? What risks are there that could take down your viability? So I know at PRMIA, we have a certain set of legs for a stool, we call it, which are different business areas. And in-person L&D is a good earner for us. And that obviously is something that cannot be done during COVID times. Mm-hmm. So I am looking at our finances and our viability and saying, okay, how can we ensure that we have the most possible income from different business lines, and then what would happen to us as an entity if we lost any of those because of something like what we would not have imagined, like COVID a few years ago. Mm-hmm. And then it's to say to yourself, okay, have I built up sufficient reserves that if there was some event like that I can maintain my business for a certain amount of time, where if quite possibly you have no income for several weeks, several months, and so on. We were lucky, we're an American association, so we were lucky we had access to the PPP loans and so on that allowed us to help weather that storm. But there may be some event that happens in the future where if you haven't thought to yourself, what are the risks to my business? What are my different business lines and way that my members interact with me? What would happen if that just went away? So speaking to the chapter network, which I think we're good at, and as part of my role as CEO, I want to make us much better at, but we had to mitigate that risk to some degree by going online. I think the business can still, overall, our L&D business and other things we're doing can pivot more online as well to allow us to serve more of a global market. And if there was some other event that meant that we couldn't do social interaction again, that we could go back to what we did before. So, it's good. You mentioned a lot of very good risks there, Cecilia, but if I was your risk person, I'd say, okay, let's look at the other side of the risk taxonomy or the different risk categories. And you might have somebody who's sitting on your board or something who's focusing on, as you said, slips and falls, and you'd say, but I think we have an issue with our board in that we don't have a nomination committee and we're not getting good volunteers coming forward to serve as board members. So, very quickly, you might say to yourself, there's a high inherent risk of having poor volunteers serving the board. We need a control or an action to mitigate that. We put in place a nomination committee to go out and search for people. And then we should hope that the residual risk is much lower and is within our risk appetite. And that kind of wording that I use there, inherent residual appetite, is the wording of risk management, but you can apply that to any activity. If you're going out on a sailboat for the day or you're going out in the car, you can say, there's a high inherent risk of me getting killed in my car, but by wearing a seatbelt and driving under the speed limit and staying on the correct side of the road, the residual risk is within my appetite, so I will go to the shop and buy some food. Come back and cook it.
I really like, Kevin, that I'm sorry, why we keep saying Kevin. We talked about too many Kevins.
We have so many Kevins.
We have had many Kevins on the show, and Justin so far is our only Justin. So we apologize, Justin. You are the one unique Justin. So Justin, also, I think there is an actor named Kevin McCarthy too. So I think I'm mashing that.
I should look on the IMDb later, the internet.
I think it's a Kevin McCarthy actor. I'm not sure. Anyway, Justin, who is just in time to help us wrap up the episode. I love that you expanded risk away from liability into the other areas of risk for associations and nonprofits. So thank you for doing that. We are already near the end of our episode. I would love to be able to dig in for another half hour, but we'll just have to have you back, Justin.
I will be very happy to come back. And if you want to focus on a particular topic, we can do that.
That would be excellent. But before we sign off for this week, I'd like to see if Agnes has any other questions or comments.
Well, thank you, Justin, for sharing your insights in the risk world. I think definitely considering the volatile times that we live in, the issue of risk is something that should be, at the forefront of our minds, even in our personal lives, and your perspective is definitely valuable. But as part of your closing thought, one of the things that I think we would like to hear from you to share with our global community are who are the stakeholders that needs to have a seat at the table to have this discussion? Because I know that it takes more than one person, it takes more than the CEO. And as you know, not all associations have the same business model. Not all of them have chapters. So who are the key essential people that needs to sit around the table to have a discussion around risk issues that impact our business?
Yeah, I think no risk program works unless you speak to your own internal staff. So they're an amazing stakeholder. They will think of things you never thought of. Our boards are always great thought leaders and are a form of risk management. So these are people who are further along in their careers and can tell you things that you just never thought of. And Craig Conrad, who was one of our CEOs before, he's not on our board, but he's gone on to the National Contracts Association, and I check in with him now and then. So you look for, he's a head of another association. I call him a peer, but he's miles ahead of me. And then whether it's chapters, whether it's members and so on, you must speak to your members. And if you're not speaking to your chapters, your member on the ground and so on, they're not going to tell you things you know. And what I'll say is, in the last 3 or 4 months, and especially in the last month since I've become CEO, I've just been picking random members or random members of our profession and just talking to them. Some of the ideas they've come up with have been amazing and are being implemented by us over the next couple of months. So I think spread it broad, speak to as many as you can, and then execute and get on with it.
Wow, what a great closing thought. Thank you, Justin. And we always like to ask our guests if somebody would like to contact you later and continue the conversation with you outside this episode, what's the best way to get in touch?
So you can find me on LinkedIn. My full name at the end is Justin C. McCarthy. So I had that at the end. And also you can find me on email. I'm sure I won't get spammed, or you can edit this out if it's poor practice, but justin.mccarthy@PRMIA.org. And you know, I already get a massive email since I've become a CEO selling me services I don't need. But if you want to get in touch either about helping me on my own association journey, and I've said to Cecilia I need to work in my own CAE, or if you want to find out about risk management while we focus on financial services, to be honest, the fundamentals and the first principles are the same no matter where you are. If you just want to have a Zoom call and a chat, look me up, have a chat, and it helps me learn whenever I speak to people.
Oh, that's great. Well, thank you, Justin. And actually, we encourage email, but not phone numbers. So, or LinkedIn. So thank you so much, Justin. This has been great. It's already been a multi-leveled conversation, but we've just scratched the surface of risk proofing associations. So thank you. And I know you will be back because we just have to dig in more and hear more. Also, we'd love to hear more about your journey as a new CEO. So we'll have you on to talk about that. But we need to go rogue for now. We'll be back next week with another exciting episode of Chatting with Agnes and Cecilia, Nonprofit Conversations. We are available on both audio and video formats at YouTube, Spotify. We're also available on Amazon Music now, which means you can also find us on Audible. So look us up there. Or on your favorite podcast provider. You can pretty much find us anywhere in audio format. If you'd like to learn more about Rogue Tulips, visit us at our website, roguetulips.com. If you, like Justin, are interested in beginning your CAE journey, check out the 501c League at the 501cleague.net. That is our program where we provide CAE education and training. So look us up there. Thanks again, everyone. And on behalf of Agnes, Justin, and myself, we will see you next time. And don't forget to subscribe.